Speaking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm here today with Glenn Allen Cheney, who is a local author, publisher, translator, painter, poet, whatever, who's been on the show before. I think the first time he was on the show was back in like 2004 or 5 when we had first started, and he had recently written and published a book on his walk through Brazil.
Oh.
So he has a new book out, and we're going to talk about that and a lot of other things that are going on in the world. So welcome, Glenn.
Well, it's good to be back.
And
I was here before even 2005, back in the 90s, when we were, Millstone was a problem.
Yeah.
We had a
so
regular
you've been
show.
On public access here,
Yeah.
before
you were born, that's right.
Well, not quite that. We're the same age, more or less, I think. But I did want to ask you, this current book, do you want to just say a couple words about why you thought to write it and maybe hold it up so people can see it? It's called Notions from a Time of Peril.
Yeah, what I did was I was writing a column for the Times weeklies that the Day owns, and I also wrote guest columns for the Day. And after a couple of years, I decided to put them all together and put them into a book.
And the Day lets you do that?
Huh?
And the Day lets you do that?
Well, there was a bit of an argument about it, but I'd rather not get into that.
Yeah, well, Steve Schlossberg did sort of the same thing recently, so I guess...
Did they let him do that?
Yeah. I don't know, but he did.
Yeah.
He was at the Stonington Farmers Market a month or so ago with a table selling it, so I'm guessing he must have had permission or
I guess
something. This last 2 years has been a very strange 2 years. I think everyone will kind of admit that. But, is that the specific time frame you were thinking about when you collected this particular group of essays from the newspaper? How this year has impacted us?
Yeah, no, I was trying not to write about COVID, which is really, so the editor there, Lee Howard, said, look, don't write about politics and don't write about COVID, which really doesn't leave very much, What else is there? So I pretty much managed to avoid the politics. There were a few things about COVID, just couldn't, resist it, but I ended up writing about other little topics like pawn shops and penmanship and lawns and green burial and hiccups and skunks and roadside litter and stuff like that. That was just free of politics and a moment that we cannot think about COVID.
Yeah, I think that's really was a wise idea. I actually looked at some of those columns online partly to see what the commenters said about them, and it was really interesting. I don't know if you read when people comment on the things you have in there.
There weren't very many comments.
There weren't a lot of comments, but there were a couple people who were giving you grades, like this was this one was an A+, this one I didn't like so much.
No, I didn't see that, no.
You got a couple A+ in there, so that was good. But I thought it was interesting that some readers feel like, it's their job to evaluate everything they write.
Fine with me.
But I guess, you and I are similar in age, I think, and we both grew up during the Cold War. And so I would say of my childhood, probably of yours too, that we grew up thinking that on a certain level the world was full of peril. You know, that we were.
Oh yeah.
When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, we were at an age, we were young, but not so young that we couldn't figure out that there was something big going on. So.
Yeah, from the age of, I don't remember, 8 or 9 or 10, I was aware of the fact that 20 minutes from now, this could all be gone.
Yeah, I think our generation was very much impacted by that. I remember as a kid, anytime grew up in Philadelphia, and anytime like a military kind of jet plane flew overhead, it's like I kind of froze. You know, we were doing we didn't do the hide under your desk kind of drills. We were doing
we had to do those.
We were sitting in the hallway drills, like
Yeah.
sitting on the floor against the wall with our head tucked between our knees or something. But I think that it was just a time, and then many years passed, and I think, at least for me, that sense of imminent peril kind of faded away. And over the last couple years and over the last couple weeks, it seems like it's kind of back. So, not wanting to write about the perils that are scaring us all right now, how do you come up with topics?
I don't know. That was, all right, so one purpose of the book was I wanted to prove to myself that I could come up with a topic and write something every week consistently. And I didn't quite succeed at that, but I came up with ideas, but they were politics or COVID.
Yeah.
I had to come up with other things, and they would just happen at random. It would, I remember we were having dinner there, and we had a guest at our house, and she mentioned hiccups, and just something inside me goes, ding, hiccups. Hiccups. I've never read anything about hiccups. And
so tell us, what did you write about hiccups?
well, you'd have to read it to find out. But I got into the history of hiccups and the causes of it, and a case of a young girl who had hiccups for months and months and months, and she claimed that she lost her mind and she killed somebody. Tried to blame it on the hiccups. I think she's still in jail.
Yeah, it did.
It did. I don't think that one worked.
It didn't work as a defense.
No. And somebody else had the hiccups for decades. Man, he got hit in the head, I think. And for decades, he hiccuped every 3 seconds, which made it really hard to eat. and then one day, when he was like 96 years old, they stopped. And within a year, he was dead. So, hiccups, right?
Well, yeah.
There's a lot of interesting stuff like that. What causes hiccups? So when you're first born, your first breath is literally a hiccup. There's a little spasm that makes that baby go, and that's the first breath. Your first breath is a hiccup.
So it isn't just the bane of our existence.
It's got a purpose, I guess.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
And I did look through. I think most of your columns, when they were originally in the paper, I had read them, but I kind of looked back at them, and which one was I thinking? Oh, now I just lost my train of thought. There was one specific one that I was thinking about. Oh well, it'll come back. So, unfortunately, even though you tried to write about things that weren't COVID, and I'm guessing moving forward you're going to try to write about things that are in Ukraine, but what do you see as? I did have something. Oh, what topics do you see coming up here? I see that you mostly have written things, just the details of everyday life. And what I think I had meant to say, I am really not used to this afternoon thing, is how you can. I'll be back. Over the past couple weeks, and we talked about this a little before the show, one of the first times you were on the show, you also mentioned your trip to Chernobyl. And without talking about current news, because we don't really know what's happening over in Ukraine, beyond what the news says, and we're not even sure that isn't all conflicting. Can you tell us a little bit about what the trip to Ukraine was like 30 years ago and why you did that? Because, when I look at your books, your experiences are not necessarily connected or well, yeah. So when I was thinking about this show, usually I think about being very sequential and having a certain arc. And this time I looked at the essays and thought they're kind of all over the place in terms of, they're all, or most of them, about little details of everyday life, but they are really not, there's no overarching theme really. But I am interested in like what you found when you visited Ukraine 30 years ago, and because I feel as though there's a lot of interest in Ukraine suddenly, and a lot of Americans feel kinship with Ukraine, but don't really know very much about it in spite of that. So I was hoping that maybe your experience from 30 years ago might shed a little bit of light on that region in general, apart from what's going on today.
Yeah, well, so when I got there, so the United Nations sent me to St. Petersburg to write about a conference they were having there. And I had a visa for 3 days. And in those 3 days, the Soviet Union disappeared.
What timing?
What timing? They should have sent me there 50 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought, well, if there's no more Soviet Union, then I don't need a visa. I was interested in Chernobyl. I didn't know anything about, nobody knew anything about Chernobyl at that point. That it was supposedly 32 people had died, and it was all covered up and not a problem. So I rather stupidly got on a train and went down to Kyiv, and just through dumb luck ended up talking to the right people who got me to talk to more people. And it's really, the book isn't about Chernobyl itself as much as about the people at this incredible juncture in history where, Kyiv, this was 5 years after the accident. The drinking water was radioactive. There were different radioactive zones depending on your distance from the plant. And all of a sudden, there was, they had a centrally controlled economy. It was communism. And so all the companies were owned by the government, a government that no longer existed. So who was working for whom, and where was the money going to come from? And besides the usual Soviet shortages and everything, now there was a question of, what's money and where's stuff going to come from? And of course, on top of that, there's a lot of people with cancer and other diseases, and some because of Chernobyl, but some because of the lead in the gasoline, and some just sheer stress, the stress of that situation. Not knowing who your government is, not knowing who you're working for, not knowing where you're going to get your food, not knowing what you're going to do with your money. Everything's radioactive. So yeah, they were. It was the first time they could actually talk to a foreign journalist, I guess. And I was in people's living room. They're literally crying in front of me, just because they were finally able to tell somebody about what had happened. These were workers who had worked at Chernobyl, or their families had lived nearby. And they just felt totally oppressed. I mean, Ukraine's had a terrible history from day one, and they certainly, Stalin starved them all, and just went in there and just took all their food, just took and like 1 million people died. I don't know the number, but it was millions died in a man-made famine. They call it a famine, but it wasn't. Somebody just took all their food.
Well, that kind of happened with the so-called Irish potato famine.
It's the same kind of thing, yeah.
That it wasn't that there wasn't food, it just wasn't getting to the people who grew it.
Right. So they had that in the past, and then they had the whole Soviet experience in general, I imagine wasn't very good, and then Chernobyl, and they just felt really, really oppressed by the whole situation. and everybody was so nice, and I was helpless. I didn't speak the language. The mafia was the controlling organization at the time. I was completely at everybody's mercy, if you will. Everybody was helpful. Everybody fed me. Everybody was so nice. They were really, really nice people. And now you got this Putin problem, and there they are one more time being slammed by the Russians. And I think that's probably partly why they're defending themselves. I guess they just have. I'm just imagining this. I haven't spoken with any of them, but they've just had enough. They've had enough. They're gonna beat Putin, or they're gonna die. One or the other. It seems, from what I read in the press.
So there is some long history. I know when I lived in Israel, Ukraine was a breadbasket area, and when I lived in Israel in the 1970s, we spent some time on a kibbutz that had been settled by Russians. Actually, it wasn't real common, but it had been settled in the early 1930s, largely by Russians. But one of the Russians I talked to, who was an older woman who had arrived. This was 1970, so she probably arrived as a young woman in the 1930s, and she said very few Russians, people would go on kibbutz because they thought of them as being the same as the old kolkhoz, the old communist farms.
Oh yeah.
And they just had these lifetime ill feelings about the whole, that part of the food system as a result of how they were treated. And I don't know what part, when we were there, the Soviet Union was, I don't know if it was exactly at its peak in the early 1970s, but it was still a real force then.
Oh, it was pre-Glasnost and all that.
So at the time, it was just interesting. We did meet, some Russians there who had, spent 10 years getting visas to leave. And then, in the 3 days you were there, everything changed.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. So other than, have you ever gone back there?
No, I'd like to. I'll tell you, this is, look, I don't know if anybody ever told you, but I'm a complete idiot. I would go back to Ukraine right now if there were if I could do something.
Yeah.
I would just make a bad situation worse, I'm sure, because.
Yeah.
But I have that urge to go back there and help with that situation.
I think that actually happens a lot with people in the United States, though, is that, things happen and we don't really know how to make things better. We have not really necessarily been good at that, even places where we've intervened with good intentions. And there have been places we've intervened with less than good intentions, but even with good intentions, I don't think we have a lot of understanding of other cultures and history. We don't study history very well. We don't really.
We don't learn from history very well.
So if you feel like you're an idiot, I think we're all idiots here.
Well, I just mean that, if I went there and I can't talk to anybody, and what am I going to do? They're going to have to take care of me. I'm not going to be helping them. They're going to be helping me. So anyway, I'm not going.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that is mentioned when you go to your website is that you do translations, and they're mostly from Portuguese, right?
That's right.
So you've spent a lot of time in Brazil, and I'm guessing that you've had a lot of influence. It has influenced you, not that you've influenced Brazil, but in that you do a lot of translation of Brazilian works. How did you get started doing that?
Well, okay, so I was first in Brazil in 1974. I basically hitchhiked from Connecticut to Sao Paulo, not really wanting to go there, but that's where I ran out of money, so that's where I stayed. And
well, you got a pretty long ways, though.
I got a pretty long ways, and boy, if you want to learn a language quickly, be broke in a foreign country. You pick up the essentials very quickly. But, I survived that and came back to the States, and I went back to Brazil and married a Brazilian and came back here. Then we moved down there again, and I go back all the time now for research, and I've traveled all over the country. And little by little, I never studied the language, but little by little, basically learned it, I guess. And then I heard about these, there was the Ministry of Culture there. I was offering grants for publishers who wanted to translate Brazilian works and publish them in other languages. And so we applied for a grant. We got it, and turned out a very complete, not complete, but a very big collection of stories by Machado de Assis, somebody that nobody around here has ever heard of. He's considered one of the top 100 writers in the history of Western civilization, and widely praised by Harold Bloom and Susan Sontag and Carlos Fuentes, and people who know their literature, and Woody Allen.
Who's fallen a bit in esteem, but
I
still.
shouldn't mention. Anyway, he's not in the book. So that went very well, and so we actually, it was a collection of stories. I translated 3 of them, and then we got professors of Brazilian culture and such to do the rest. And that went very well, so we applied again and did another one. We've done at least a dozen now, I guess. Not always me. Sometimes I'm just the editor, or I help a Brazilian put it into English.
But you know enough Portuguese to do that piece.
Yeah,
where
I can translate Portuguese into English. I can't go in the other direction.
That makes sense. Well, you mentioned the way to learn a language is to be broke in a foreign country. I've always wondered whether people really get worse at learning language after puberty, because it seems like that happens.
That's true, yeah.
Whether it's an organic thing, or if you really, to learn a language, you have to be motivated, and your survival kind of needs to depend on it. And once people get to a certain age, they're not usually in that kind of a dependent situation. And,
Well, there's something about the brain, and don't ask me to explain it, but children can pick up languages like that.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. I mean, like in weeks. I don't know how they do it.
No,
and
they
teenagers, but after that, it gets a little harder.
It does get it. I know. Once again, when I was in Israel, people said, when you went, if your Hebrew wasn't great, once you had a stint in the army, you learned Hebrew. It's like your life depended on it. You learned it. But kids are amazing with languages, and I do sometimes wonder if Americans are less flexible in our thinking than people in many other parts of the world, because our brains, many of us, have only really been exposed to one language.
That could be.
A lot of the people who only know English actually don't know English very well, which I've observed like time and again. You can't help but notice sometimes that people who just say English first, really, their own English is,
they don't
something
respect
to be desired. So I do wonder if, there's a part of our brain that has not, gotten developed because we weren't exposed to so many languages.
Could very well be.
I'm sure when you were in Ukraine 30 years ago, everyone who lived there at least knew 2 languages, Ukrainian and Russian, and probably...
Oh, all right. Well, yeah, they didn't speak English for the most part. I was lucky to find a couple of people who spoke English, but, this was Soviet Union. They weren't teaching people English.
Yeah. No,
and boy, talk about learning to survive. I mean, I had a little Berlitz book, and I'm, getting the basics down, but it was a very dangerous time. And, my boots were probably worth somebody a month of salary for these people, literally. And so I was very worried, and I knew that somebody could, knock me off, and my family wouldn't know what happened to me, and nobody would report it, and the police weren't anything there. And so when 2 people were speaking to each other, I was paying attention to everything they said, even though I couldn't understand it, but trying to get the gist of what they were saying, and trying to, there was one thing, it was a New Year's Eve party, and we're all sitting around drinking vodka, and somebody there starts to tell a joke, and I could tell it was a joke. That I don't know how I could tell, but I knew it, and he got to the end of the thing, and everybody laughed, and I laughed too. And he told me later on, one of the other guests pulled him over in the kitchen and said, "Be careful with him. He's not who he says he is."
Because
they thought that I had understood. Yeah.
Oh. Oh, that is funny, though. But, yeah, you really do. So did you learn any Russian when you were there, too?
Well, basic, where is, how much, I want, I need, please, thank you.
Yeah, I totally believe that because also when we went to Israel, we spent 6 months in this Hebrew class. People who were settling, they had this Hebrew program that was 6 months, and it was free. You worked half day, you studied half day, and there were a few people there from, the Soviet Union at the time, and they spoke multiple languages, but English was usually not one of them. There was a brother and sister in the cabin next to us, and they spoke Russian, Hungarian, and Yiddish. So they knew 3 languages. None of them was English. And it was quite common to find, most of the, Jewish people who came, who had come from that part of Europe, did know Yiddish, but they often knew their, local language plus whatever national language they were in. So, I really got the sense there that the people from the United States were almost the only people in the world who
monoglots.
only monoglots in the world. And I sometimes feel as though I don't know, there's something in our brain chemistry that's a little deficient because of that lack. That
would explain a lot, wouldn't it?
It would. I feel like in many, many ways, Americans are the worst people I've met practically for being able to put themselves in the shoes of others.
Yeah. Well, all right, so I went to Italy there with the family 10 or 15 years ago, and so on the airplane, I'm just walking up and down the aisles of this 747 or whatever it was with a Berlitz book, repeating phrases in Italian so that I could, when I got there, I could get around. I couldn't find anybody who didn't know English.
Yeah.
Every taxi driver, everybody.
And they wanted to speak it too, or not?
They were perfectly willing to speak it. And, I would say something in Italian and they'd answer me in English, and that would be the end of that.
Because I was in Paris for a couple of days in 1969, and at that time the Parisians, they knew English, but they wouldn't speak it.
Right.
And I really felt, I had high school French, which wasn't great, but I could kind of muddle through, and I kept thinking to myself, 2 months here and I'd be fluent, and because we got into some minor problems. I had gone one place and Bob and I were meeting down in the metro, but I didn't have any money on me, so I had to convince the person at the ticket counter that I'd get money from Bob down there and bring it back if she'd only let me through. And I had to do it in French, but I'm sure she would have understood English, but she was not letting on. She was not, but she did let me through.
It's a complicated thing to explain.
Yeah, and she was totally shocked when I came back with the whatever it was, 50 cents.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was everywhere. Our travelers' checks got lost. In American Express, they spoke English, but we filed a report at the police department, and they wouldn't let us speak English. I mean, they wouldn't. It wasn't that they told us we couldn't. They just pretended they didn't understand it. So yeah, but I think things have changed. I think people, when you go places around the world, a lot of people do want to try out their English on you now. Doesn't help us get smarter, though.
Yeah, right.
So this is not sort of non sequitur, but you mentioned in the title of this book, it's a time of peril, and if anything, we're more of in a time of peril than we were, when you started this 2 years ago. But one of the things I worry about is we're looking at the obvious perils in front of us. COVID, a little less so now. It's a little, I hope it's in the rearview mirror. I don't feel sure that it is. And, the latest destabilization in world politics. but there are a lot of perilous things going on in the world that we're not actually paying very good attention to. And it seemed like in some of your essays, you did touch on some of them, like, the fires in California. So, I don't know, what are your thoughts on what should we Americans be thinking about now or doing right now?
There's nothing to do. It's hopeless. No, climate catastrophe is the big thing. We've got to solve that, and we're running out of time, and it's not moving very fast, and there's God knows plenty of people who just want to deny that the whole thing's happening. And if Donald Trump gets reelected, and right now it looks like the odds are in his favor, that's the end of the world.
Although I fear that, even with him not elected, we're not motorboating to the abyss.
That too.
But we're maybe paddling towards it still. We visited California last summer. Well, California and Oregon. We do practically every summer because we have family there, and we had planned to take Amtrak from San Francisco. Our son lives in the Bay Area, down up to Oregon, where Bob's family is, and we got to the train station and went to check our bags, and we were going, check our bags in the morning and spend the day in San Francisco and come back and take the overnight train. And I gave them the bags, and they said, "Oh, they'll only go as far as Sacramento." I said, "Sacramento? We're like going to Klamath Falls." Say, "Yes, the tracks are too hot. We're not running any trains. We'll let you know what the alternative plans are."
Oh.
And I guess they were going to put us on a bus. But yeah, they weren't even running freight trains on the tracks. Huh. This was in late July. The temperatures were, I like a desert kind of climate, but it was, maybe 106 or 7 degrees, very dry heat in that area. But what was scary is when you passed mountains, like Mount Shasta, there wasn't any snow on them in July, early July. So it was a little unnerving, but, this year, who knows what can happen this summer and the next summer and the next summer.
Yeah.
And I do fear that we need more action than is coming from those who claim to care or say they care or maybe do care but don't feel the urgency to get really discomforted enough to take.
They're not doing nearly enough, and they could do more. But there's resistance among a certain political party I need not mention, I suppose. But
I don't have faith in the Democrats either.
Well,
I've been working on this universal health care issue in Connecticut, even a blue state, right? And
it's not happening.
No, I was told, and this was, I think I can say this publicly because it was like a year ago, that there were a lot of groups pushing for a public option, which is not optimal, but it would help a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the state controller, Kevin Lembo, who just resigned due to health issues, was a big supporter of doing this. And he was basically told by the governor to let it go. So it's like the insurance companies, 5 of them wrote a letter threatening to move their offices out of Connecticut if we pass the public option. And so I won't say there's no political will, but there isn't enough political will. And even after we've had this pandemic for like 2 years in a blue state, we can't really get more than very small, expansions.
Yeah.
And so I really do worry that we need more action. Maybe I'm just getting old and impatient, I don't know.
No, there's been very little movement toward
and
that.
climate, also. So I do worry that, although Trump has his popularity, I kind of think, although Dick Cheney still keeps hanging in year after year, but I keep thinking that Trump's health is really at some point going to get in the way of his actually having to being able to serve in office.
But the next guy will try to be the same thing.
The next guy will be, but it is really. But I think part of the problem is that no one is really offering people who are struggling an answer, and that's what lets the worst get in, the very worst, because even the best isn't really addressing. But on that cheery note, you mentioned in one of the essays, and I don't know if it's one of the ones in your book or not, about looking at our past predictions of the future, or your past predictions of the future we're in now from the perspective of 45 or 50 years ago, or many, many years ago. So what did you expect, and is it what we got?
Yeah, well, it's funny you should bring that up. The person who inspired the Hiccup story was the same one who asked me that question. Is this what you thought was going to happen 50 years ago? So I wrote about that, and I thought we were supposed to by now. I mean, even just 21st century seemed like impossibly distant, and that a quarter of a century into it, we'd have the flying cars and the, world peace and age of Aquarius and all that stuff. And obviously it didn't happen. We did not see the internet coming, which is the biggest thing that has come down the pike.
No, I mean,
I foresaw a nuclear war. I thought it just seemed almost inevitable.
Yeah, well, it's so funny because when you were talking about being in Chernobyl and totally like no one would know if you didn't come back what happened to you, I mean, that could happen nowadays, but it's rare. People have cell phones. I don't know what it's like to be a parent. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like actually to be a parent when I was, a parent of my kids who are now grown-ups, and it's even more true of my parents who, parenting me, that, I'd go to downtown Philadelphia with a friend, and if I didn't come home, no one would have any idea. And now everyone expects to know, like, where their kids are at every moment, where their partners are at every moment, where their parents are at every moment. It's like we know there's so much uncertainty taken out of life that I agree that's something that I think I never would have foreseen.
Yeah.
And we were watching TV shows like The Jetsons. So
Yeah,
I
right,
guess
exactly. Yes.
we could be excused for having that perception. But so looking forward, do you have any thoughts?
I'm a terrible pessimist, and 2050 isn't that far away. It seems impossibly distant, and yet you look back 30 years, and 30 years ago doesn't seem very far back.
It doesn't.
And what we're seeing with the forest fires and the floods and the storms and everything, and tornadoes in the winter, and this is just the beginning. It isn't really even happening, and I just think it's going to get pretty awful. More refugees and wars over resources, and I don't see how it can not get ugly. But I've been wrong in the past, and I hope I'm wrong again.
Well, yeah, I keep thinking about. I pretty much am pessimistic about what the governments of major powers, at least, will be able to do to help it. There might be some governments of small countries that are still governments of the people, by the people, and for the people, but I think they're relatively rare. So I feel as though whatever gets done has to get done outside of the political realm. Although you said you're a selectman, right?
I'm on the board of selectmen, yeah.
So In your town, and I'm on the Planning and Zoning Commission here, so, you know, so there are some things that can be done, especially through local governance. So, being on the Board of Selectmen, what do you feel is the kind of thing you can make a change in, and what kind of thing do you feel like present limitations?
Yeah, that's hard to answer because I could talk about my one little town, but there are tens of thousands of little towns.
And
And
169 just in our little state.
Just in Connecticut. And I don't know, I don't see anything really effective happening unless it's at a national and global level. You've got to force everybody to cooperate on this. We can't just count on individual. So let's say I get rid of my car and I ride my bicycle 8 miles to the grocery. It's not going to make any difference. It's got to be an overall overarching policy. One thing we are doing in our town, though, is I'm on the board of the Connecticut Green Burial Connecticut Green Burial Grounds, and we're trying to start green burial grounds, and we finally found a way that we can probably do it right in our own little town. There's a cemetery existing, and there's some land for sale right beside it, and if we can just buy that piece, make it a town cemetery, but exclusively for green burials, then that might work out. It'll help about that much, but it's something.
Well, it gives a good option for people, too, because, the other options aren't good.
No, they aren't.
I guess that, and I am not religious at all, but I guess Jewish burials are greener than many.
Yeah.
But...
yeah, they're basically green.
The
difference in green burial would be a green burial ground is returned to nature. You don't mow the grass. There's no vault. I don't know if the Jewish have a vault underneath. Other cemeteries require.
I don't think. I think it's I don't.
They want a vault in order to keep the land flat on top, which is just perfectly stupid. Because if you just take the dirt and put it, make that classic mound, it settles down.
That's a good question. I have no idea, and as I said, I'm not religious at all. I'm kind of don't believe in a lot of Judaism, but it seems like the idea that it isn't necessarily plain pine boxes that people are buried in, but there's no metal in the construction, whatever kind of wood it is or however fancy it is. It's all fitted together with joinery and and pegs and not with screws and bolts. And shrouds rather than
rather than a box.
Yeah, and so it's relatively green, I guess, but this does seem like a superior option, especially if the land is being kept as open space.
Yeah, it's kept as open space. It's public space, and it's just returned to nature. It's a nature preserve. It doesn't look like a cemetery at all, and there are certain people who would prefer to be buried that way. No tombstone, and maybe ideally plant a tree.
Well, you're just talking about that, gets me thinking about something that I rant about all the time, which is like open space in Connecticut. I don't know what it's been like in your town, but in New London and in many other towns, I know this is happening in Willimantic, we see a lot of apartment buildings being built. And we see some of this housing happening in parcels of land where it's appropriate, in the middle of the city, an infill lot that's been a hole in the ground and not really very productive. But we're seeing in some places that are important, have value as open space, being encouraged for residential development in a city like New London or a state like Connecticut that's losing population. And I keep wondering why we're building these hundreds of units or thousands of units of apartments on open space.
Yeah.
Is that happening in your town?
Well, what do you mean by open space? You mean publicly owned land?
Yeah. some of it is, or some of it might be privately owned land, but uplands of a, of a wetland, not wetland itself. But so I don't know. I think it might be some of it privately owned but undeveloped. But instead of becoming a public open space,
Yeah.
it's getting built on.
Yeah. Well, I'm all in favor of public space. I don't know what's happening in other towns. In our town, we managed to rescue a great big piece of land, now known as Sprague Land Preserve. And with a lot of support from Senator Kathy Austin, who wanted this thing to work, and we got one big piece. I don't remember the acreage, it's now like 96 acres. But then there was one adjacent that was a couple hundred, and then another one adjacent to that. It's now 700 something acres.
Oh, that is huge.
And it was a struggle because the Economic Development Commission wanted to sell this land and make it a gravel pit. This is an old forest. This is a forest that's like 100 years old, right on the banks of the Chautauqua River. Beautiful piece of land. And they wanted to just clear cut it, dig down till they hit bedrock, and then return it. This was their line: return it to nature in perpetuity. It would be nothing but rock.
Oh my God.
Anyway, it was a big political struggle in our town, and we had a referendum, and people voted for the open space. And it has since then it has grown, and now it's huge, and it's right next to Mohegan State Park, and it's
wow, that's fantastic.
it's adding up to thousands of acres. Yeah.
I guess we take these little victories because they do. Although you're riding your bike, around, and I was a bicycle commuter for about 15 or 20 years as well. Although that probably won't make much of a dent. Hundreds of acres of open space instead of a gravel pit makes a little bigger dent in the overall well-being of the natural environmental conditions in our state.
Well, you make the dent you can make, I guess, right?
It really points to the power of referenda too, because in New London we had our very much smaller scale referendum on whether to sell Riverside Park to the Coast Guard Academy, and their plans. Well, I don't know what their plans were. They changed them every week it seemed.
But people voted for the park.
Barely, but yes. It was very close. It was like 19 vote gap.
Oh wow.
So yeah, it was really close. It was not cut and dried because it wasn't it was kind of a beautiful space if you look past the part that wasn't beautiful, but it had been neglected for so long that it was full of invasive weeds, and it just had a lot of trash. The city hadn't maintained it in decades, so it didn't really look prime, but you could if you could see past that.
Yeah.
And it's still a struggle. It still has invasive species there, and it's still
But it's not
it
a
still
parking
needs
lot.
work.
Yeah.
But it's not a parking lot. It's not a football field. It's not a diversity center. I think that was one of the plans, which. So what was I? So you're going to continue now. This book has columns through about last summer or fall, right? And you're continuing to write your column?
Not very regularly, just once in a while. It's kind of this little argument with the day. It's very unclear as to who has the copyright for this material and who owns it.
Oh.
As far as I'm concerned, I own the copyright, and I never signed a paper otherwise, and I think I own it, and I have the right to publish a book. But the publisher of the day said that he's got the copyright, or the day has the copyright, and he kind of granted me permission. He said, yes, you can publish it, but he wouldn't put it in writing. It was just an email. And so I'm reluctant to write something if I don't know that I'm going to own it or who's going to own it. And
right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I don't know where that's going to go. But it was so much fun to write this stuff, to come up with an idea and think,
yeah.
And there were a lot of work. They might look really simple because I write in a very simple style, but it would take me a full day to write one of these things, and that's a piece of the work week.
Well, I think that is talking about the book. One of the things that's really interesting about reading it is that your style is kind of light and fun, but sometimes the content is pretty deep or heavy. So there's often that kind of, tension between the two things that makes it a lot of fun.
Yeah. And all of these things, I would just get an idea and I would just start to write. I didn't know where it was going, and I'd always be surprised to get the 650 words, and all of a sudden it does a deep dive into something I had not expected. It's almost like somebody has just given it to me. I throw myself back and I think, how did I do that?
So should we tell people if they have like quirky ideas, they should get in touch with you or not bother?
No, people give me ideas all the time, and
Yeah.
they usually just don't work out. It's just got to be something that. But I'll be glad to take an idea.
I mean, I was very glad to see that you wrote, and it was your idea, but that you wrote about our green and golden mural because the one at the New London street mural, that I don't think is in the book, but was in the newspaper.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I wrote the one about the Nelson. What do they call
Yeah,
it?
the mandala.
Mandala. Yes.
Yes, the mandala that we paint every year. And it is, that's been an interesting situation because a block away, the city of New London painted their own mural. There was just different kind of stripes for diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't learn the lesson. It takes work to maintain these things.
Oh, yeah.
So we have 4 minutes left. And maybe in the 4 minutes you can mention some of the other books you've written that you have around where people can get in touch with you or find out more about you.
Well, let's see. A lot of my books are in the New London Public Library. By no means all of them, and I've written on the Pilgrims and Abraham Lincoln and a nun in the Amazon and another one about nuns in other countries and stuff like that. I wrote one about cats. I wrote one about burial practices. I wrote one about honeybees. Whatever comes into my little mind.
So you feel like it's a compulsion to write whether you do anything with it after or not?
Yeah, right.
One quick question. We have like 3 minutes left. Is this your cover art?
Yes, it is.
Because I know that some of the older books haven't been your own cover art, but I've noticed that you've been painting more, and we didn't really get a chance to talk about that.
Well,
but
let me put in a word for the Drunken Palette, which is closing now. But
it is.
I had never in my life did I have an art lesson. Not even in high school. Nobody ever said, pick up the brush and go like this, and you can make a leaf. And I just assumed all I learned about art in high school was you need talent, and you haven't got it. So at the age of 65, I decided, all right, I'm gonna. I've always wanted to art. I just love paintings.
Yeah.
And I went to the Drunken Palette down there on State Street, and they started to explain it. And within 5 minutes, I thought, I can do this.
Well, maybe.
And now people buy my paintings. I put my paintings on the covers of books, and I'm just sorry to see that place closing. It was certainly.
Yeah, I hope something else opens up, and of that sort. Well, I think we're out of time, but thanks, Glenn, for the conversation.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll see you around town. Are you going to any of the farmers markets? Can people come and say hi to you anywhere?
I go up to I should do the Waterford one, but I go to the Coventry Farmers Market up there.
And just a pitch for farmers markets everywhere because our supply lines depend on them, might more so.
Mm-hmm.
So next week, Eddie Long is going to be on the show. He's going to talk about PARG, Public Art for Racial Justice, Equity, Education, and the Sister Mural project that's going on in New London. So we will see you next week, and thank you again, Glenn.
Always a pleasure, anytime. Whenever there's a crisis, you call me, all right?